The $500,000 check in my hand smelled like fresh ink and copper. And I knew it was a death warrant. 10 minutes ago, I stood on a stage in a glass ballroom, smiling while I sold a lie that will kill 4,000 people. Now, I'm shivering in a concrete service corridor, my knuckles raw from the impact of a heavy brass award against a man's wrist. I only have 4 minutes. 4 minutes before the server in the next room wipes the evidence of the defect forever. But that's not the part that's making me sick. I just found the file trail. The digital fingerprints for the fraud don't lead back to the CEO. They lead to my own living room. They used my home IP address. My wife is at that house right now. She just texted me that a maintenance crew is at the door, but we didn't call anyone. I'm being framed as the mastermind, and the clock just hit 0. Let me take you back to where this began. The crystal trophy bit into David's palm, a cold, heavy weight that threatened to slip through his damp fingers. Fluorescent camera flashes scorched the edges of his vision, turning the Chicago ballroom into a strobe-lit blur of tuxedos and silk gowns. A roar of rhythmic clapping surged from the floor, vibrating against his ribs like a physical blow. He forced his facial muscles into a practiced upward curve, though the skin around his eyes twitched with exhaustion. Beside him, Sarah leaned in, her perfume a suffocating cloud of lilies and expensive gin. "Wave, David," she hissed under the cover of the applause. "The donors want a hero, not a statue." He raised the award. The HeartLink valve sat in a velvet-lined case on the podium, a gleaming marvel of medical-grade titanium. To the 300 people in this room, it represented a miracle. To David, it was a ticking clock. He remembered the jagged tear in the prototype's casing during the last stress test, the way the synthetic flap stuttered before failing. "Dr. Miller?" A reporter from the Tribune shoved a recorder toward his chin. "How does it feel to save 10,000 lives before the fiscal year ends?" David's throat tightened. He swallowed the metallic taste of bile. He glanced at the CEO in the front row, whose grin remained fixed and predatory. "We focus on the data," David said, his voice cracking. He gripped the podium until the wood groaned. "The data tells the only story worth hearing." He lowered his hand, the heavy trophy dragging his shoulder down as he stepped away from the light. The air in the ballroom was thick, saturated with the smell of seared steak and the floral musk of $500 centerpieces. David moved through the crowd, his mind a frantic ledger of failure. He reached for his tie, straightening the silk knot exactly 3 times, left, right, center, until the symmetry offered a fleeting moment of control. Every smile he passed felt like a hairline fracture in his own integrity. He knew the truth that lay hidden beneath the polished titanium of the HeartLink valve. The lab results were clear. Under high-stress cardiac events, the valve didn't just leak, it shredded. It was a death sentence wrapped in a press release. As he neared the edge of the dance floor, a hand clamped onto his elbow. The grip was firm, urgent. David turned to find Michael Davis, his lead systems analyst. Michael's face was the color of unbaked dough, and a fine sheen of sweat coated his upper lip. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and sharp panic. "David, we have a problem," Michael whispered, his eyes darting toward the security detail lining the walls. "The IT department just initiated a deep clean. They're scrubbing the secondary drives, the cloud backups, everything. By the time the sun comes up, any record of the stress test failures will be a ghost. It's all going away, David. Permanently. Back, his voice low and jagged. That data back, his voice low and jagged. That data is the only thing protecting the patients. If we lose the logs, we lose the proof. They're doing it right now, Michael said, his voice trembling. Sterling gave the order. He's making the cover-up irreversible. You have to get to the server room. The physical terminal in the executive lounge is the only one with a hardware lock. If you can bridge the connection there, you might be able to stop the wipe. David didn't wait for another word. He turned away from the gala, leaving the applause and the clinking of crystal behind. He slipped through a heavy oak door marked "Staff Only," the sudden silence of the service corridor ringing in his ears. The hallway was narrow and oppressive, smelling of floor wax and industrial disinfectant. His footsteps echoed against the linoleum, a rhythmic clack, clack, clack that sounded like a countdown. He reached the freight elevator, but the doors remained stubbornly closed. He paced the small space, his fingers twitching toward the small, worn ledger in his pocket. He wanted to log this. The date, the time, the catastrophic failure of a corporate soul. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hall swung open. A security guard, a mountain of a man named James Anderson, stepped into the light. James didn't ask for ID. He simply planted his feet, his posture rigid and military. "Dr. Miller," James said, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Sterling requested that you stay in the ballroom, for your own safety." "Move aside, James," David said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I left something in the lounge, a personal file." "I can't do that, sir," James replied. He began to walk toward David, his boots thudding against the floor. As he walked, his lips moved silently. 1, 2, 3. David recognized the tell. James was counting his steps, a rhythmic compulsion that anchored him. When James reached for David's arm, David didn't think. He swung the heavy brass Integrity Award with both hands. The metal struck James's wrist with a sickening thud. The guard let out a choked cry, his counting broken. David lunged forward, his fingers diving into the guard's tactical vest. He felt the cold plastic of the master keycard and ripped it free. James slumped against the wall, clutching his wrist, his face twisted in a mixture of pain and shock. David didn't look back. He swiped the card against the elevator sensor, the light turning a victorious green. The doors slid open, and he stepped inside, the hum of the motor vibrating through the soles of his shoes. The elevator climbed to the 4th floor, the secure heart of the hotel. When the doors opened, the air was significantly colder, stripped of human warmth to protect the machines. David hurried down the hall to the server room, his breath turning to mist in the sterile chill. He swiped the stolen card, and the heavy steel door hissed open. Inside, the room was a cathedral of blinking blue lights and the relentless drone of cooling fans. David moved to the primary terminal, his fingers flying across the keys. He had to stop the deletion. He had to save the truth. He bypassed the initial security layers, his mind focused on the raw data packets. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. David decided to trace the origin of the falsified safety reports. This was the logical move. If he could prove that the clean data had been uploaded by an external hacker or a specific executive terminal, he could clear his name and point the finger directly at the conspirators. He had spent years as a quality engineer, and he knew that every digital action left a trail. He felt a surge of professional confidence as he navigated the system's back end. He was the expert here. He knew exactly where the logs were hidden, and he knew how to extract the truth from the noise. This was his territory, and he was going to win. Phase 2. False positive. The screen flickered, and a sequence of IP addresses began to scroll down the monitor. David's eyes scanned the numbers. He found the specific upload event from 3 nights ago. the one that replaced the failure logs with the glowing, fake reports. A triumphant smile touched his lips. The system was responding. He began the extraction process, the progress bar creeping toward 100%. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, his shoulders dropping for the first time in hours. He had the evidence. He was going to walk out of here with the smoking gun. Phase 3. The crack. He stopped. Something about the primary IP address looked familiar. It wasn't a corporate address. It wasn't the scrambled, masked sequence of a hacker. It was a residential tag. David's brow furrowed, a cold prickle of unease dancing across his skin. He leaned closer to the screen, his heart skipping a beat. He recognized the sequence. He had seen it on his own monthly bills, on his own home rotor settings. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The truth hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. The IP address belonged to his own home in Evanston. The falsified reports hadn't been uploaded from Apex headquarters. They had been sent from his own home office, using his personal credentials. The screen flashed red, and a new window popped up. User D. Miller. Access granted. David's knees went weak, and he had to grab the edge of the server rack to keep from falling. He wasn't just finding the evidence. He was looking at his own frame-up. The conspirators hadn't just hidden the truth. They had woven him into the lie. By accessing these files now, using a stolen keycard, he was validating the digital footprint they had created. To any outside investigator, it would look like David had been the one falsifying the data all along. And now he was returning to the scene of the crime to scrub his tracks. Suddenly, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a text from Sarah. "David, come home. A maintenance crew is here. They said the Wi-Fi is acting up and they need to check your office. I told them you were at the gala, but they insisted. They're in the house, David. I'm scared." The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls of the server room closing in on him. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he wasn't the hunter. He was the prey, and the trap had just snapped shut. David stumbled out of the server room, the sterile air now feeling like a tomb. He had to get home. He had to get to Sarah. He sprinted back toward the service elevator, his mind a chaotic blur of if-then scenarios. If the maintenance crew was already there, then the physical evidence was being planted. If he didn't get there in time, his life, and Sarah's, would be over. He reached the ground floor and burst out of the elevator, nearly colliding with a waiter carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. He ignored the man's indignant shout and headed for the parking garage. The transition from the opulent hotel lobby to the concrete gloom of the garage was jarring. The air here was heavy with the smell of damp stone and exhaust. He reached his car, a modest sedan that looked out of place among the Ferraris and Lexuses. He fumbled with his keys, but as he moved toward the driver's side door, he saw it. The car was sitting low, the rims resting directly on the concrete. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber hanging in jagged ribbons. "Damn it!" David hissed, kicking the front tire. A dull, hollow sound echoed through the garage. He reached for his phone to call an Uber, but the screen showed 0 bars. He held the device high, turning in a slow circle. Nothing. The signal was being jammed. A high-frequency hum, barely audible, vibrated in his inner ear, the telltale sign of a localized signal killer. He was isolated, trapped in a concrete box with no way to call for help. He turned to run toward the garage exit, but the sound of a heavy engine roared to life behind him. A black SUV, its windows tinted to a void-like black, lurched out of a parking space. It didn't head for the exit. It headed for David. The vehicle accelerated, the tires screeching against the polished concrete. David scrambled back, his boots slipping. He saw a heavy industrial trash compactor bolted to a nearby pillar. He lunged for it, throwing his body into the narrow gap between the metal machine and the concrete. The SUV slammed into the pillar a split second later, the impact vibrating through the floor and into David's teeth. The sound was a deafening crunch of metal and shattering glass. David pulled himself tighter into the shadows, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The smell of scorched rubber and hot oil filled the air. The SUV backed up, its front bumper hanging by a wire, and then it sped away, the roar of the engine fading into the distance. Down at his hands. He was still clutching down at his hands. He was still clutching the Integrity Award check, the $500,000 bribe Sterling had forced upon him on stage. In the dim light of the garage, under the flickering yellow sodium lamps, he noticed something strange about the paper. He pulled a small UV pen light from his pocket, a tool he always carried for inspecting material stress points. He clicked the light on. The check glowed, but not with the standard security fibers. A series of neon orange specks appeared across the surface, forming a distinct, coded pattern. David's stomach turned. This wasn't just a bribe. It was hot money. Currency treated with a specific chemical signature used by federal agencies in sting operations. Sterling hadn't just given him a bribe. He had handed him a tracking beacon. The moment David deposited this check, or even if it was found in his possession during a raid, the FBI would have irrefutable proof of his corruption. Sterling was coordinating with the authorities, playing both sides of the board. He was going to deliver David to the feds on a silver platter, a rogue employee caught red-handed. David knew he couldn't keep the check, but he couldn't just throw it away here. It had his prints on it now. He had to find a way to dispose of it, to neutralize the signature, but he had no time. The sirens were already faint in the distance, a low wail that was getting louder by the second. He abandoned the garage, slipping out through a pedestrian exit that led to a dark alleyway. The Chicago night was cold, the wind whipping off the lake and biting through his suit jacket. He ran, his footsteps echoing against the brick walls, heading toward the only place he had left, home. By the time David reached his neighborhood in Evanston, the adrenaline had begun to fade, replaced by a cold, numbing dread. The streets were quiet, the suburban houses glowing with the soft, amber light of television screens and bedside lamps. But his house was different. Every light in the Miller residence was on, casting long, aggressive shadows across the lawn. A white van with a generic home security logo was parked in the driveway, its engine idling. David didn't use the front door. He slipped through the side gate, his movements practiced and silent. He reached the kitchen window and peered inside. His heart stopped. Robert Sterling was sitting at the kitchen table, his silver hair gleaming under the overhead fluorescent. He was holding a glass of David's expensive bourbon, leaning back with an air of casual ownership. Sarah sat across from him, her face a mask of pure terror. She was clutching a dish towel, her knuckles white. David felt a surge of white-hot rage, but he forced himself to stay still. He had to be smart. He had to log the variables. He moved to the back door, quietly turned the lock, which had been left open, and stepped into the kitchen. "Ah, David," Sterling said, not even looking up. "I was wondering when you'd join us. Your wife has been a most gracious host, though I'm afraid she's a bit worried about your recent professional lapses." "Get out of my house, Robert," David said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. In a moment," Sterling replied. He placed a notarized document on the table, sliding it toward David. "But first, We should discuss the future, or rather, the lack of one. David looked at the paper. It was a signed confession, bearing Michael Davis's signature. The text was a detailed account of how David Miller had approached Michael with a plan to extort the company by forging safety failures in the HeartLink valve. It was a masterpiece of fabrication, blending just enough truth with the lies to make it airtight. Michael wouldn't sign this, David said, though his voice lacked conviction. Everyone has a price, David, Sterling said, leaning in. He began to count the tiles on the kitchen backsplash, his lips moving in that silent, rhythmic twitch. 1, 2, 3. And Michael's price was his daughter's college fund and a clean exit. He's already on a plane to Seattle. You, however, are still here. David felt the weight of the situation crushing him. He was isolated. He was framed. But he had one card left to play. Years ago, fearing a breach of his home office, he had installed a hidden, high-definition camera disguised as a smoke detector. It was hardwired to a local drive, hidden behind the drywall. He reached into his pocket and squeezed the remote fob. A tiny, nearly invisible blue light flickered on the ceiling. "You think you've won?" David shouted, stepping toward Sterling. He needed the camera to catch the man's face, to record the arrogance. "You're selling a product that kills people. You're murdering patients for the sake of a stock price." "I am protecting an institution," Sterling countered, his voice rising to match David's. "I am ensuring that 10,000 people have a chance at a life, even if the odds aren't perfect. You're the one trying to burn the cathedral down because of a few chipped bricks. You're a monster, Robert. You're a liar and a murderer, and I'm going to make sure the world knows it." David was screaming now, his face inches from Sterling's. Suddenly, the shadow in the corner moved. Christopher Wilson, Sterling's personal enforcer, lunged forward. He was a blur of dark fabric and cold efficiency. He swung a heavy fist, catching David in the ribs. David gasped, the air leaving his lungs in a painful rush. He stumbled back, hitting the stove. His hand closed around the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet Sarah had used for dinner. As Christopher moved in for a second strike, David swung the pan with everything he had. The iron connected with Christopher's temple with a sickening clank. The big man crumpled, his head hitting the edge of the granite counter before he slumped to the floor. "David!" Sarah screamed, rushing to his side. "We have to go," David wheezed, grabbing her arm. "Now." But as they turned toward the door, David's phone pinged. A notification from his banking app. Deposit confirmed. $500,000. The loyalty bonus had been wired. The digital paper trail was complete. He was now officially a paid-off co-conspirator. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. David felt a desperate surge of hope. He had the recording. He had Sterling on tape, in his house, making threats and admitting to the cover-up. He decided to quickly access his home office computer to upload the footage to a secure, third-party cloud server he'd set up for emergencies. This was the ultimate safeguard. Once the video was in the cloud, Sterling couldn't touch it. David knew the encryption was solid, and the upload would only take seconds. He felt a moment of intense clarity. This was his if-then solution. If he could get the video out, then the truth would survive, even if he didn't. Phase 2. False positive. He sprinted to his office and slammed the door, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The terminal woke up instantly. He opened the local drive and saw the file. living_room_ISO_01. He hit the upload button. The progress bar jumped to 20%, then 40. He could hear Sterling shouting in the kitchen, but it didn't matter. He was winning. He saw the upload successful message flash on the screen. He let out a jagged laugh, his chest heaving. He had him. He had the evidence that would destroy Apex and put Sterling in a cage for the rest of his life. Phase 3. The crack. He clicked the file to play it back, just to be sure. The video opened, but the audio was strangely muffled. He frowned, leaning closer to the speakers. He saw himself on screen, pointing a finger at Sterling. But Sterling's voice didn't sound like it had in the room. It sounded different. David's heart began to sink as he watched the footage. Something was wrong with the timing. The movements didn't quite match the words. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The truth hit him with a cold, sickening realization. The screen narrowed, and a small watermark appeared in the corner. Apex Legal Live Edit Suite. Jennifer Thompson, the company's digital specialist, hadn't just been watching him. She had intercepted the feed in real time. The secure cloud server he'd uploaded to wasn't his. It was a spoofed destination created by the company's IT team. As he watched the video play back, he saw a nightmare version of reality. The audio had been seamlessly replaced and edited. In the video, Sterling looked calm and pleading, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. David, however, looked like a raving lunatic. The edited audio made it sound like David was the one demanding more money, threatening to release fake data unless Sterling doubled the bribe. "Give me the $1 million, Robert," the fake David screamed on the screen. "Or I'll make sure the HeartLink name is mud." The video showed David lunging at Christopher without provocation. It looked like a cold-blooded assault on a security guard who was merely trying to protect his employer from an unhinged extortionist. David stared at the screen, his world tilting on its axis. He hadn't just failed to get the truth out. He had provided the company with the perfect evidence to bury him. He had recorded his own confession and his own crimes, and he had handed them directly to the people who wanted to destroy him. The sirens were in the driveway now. The red and blue lights strobed against the office walls, turning the room into a chaotic, pulsating cage. He was no longer a whistleblower. In the eyes of the world, he was a violent criminal caught in the act of a desperate, failed shakedown. "David, they're here," Sarah cried, her voice cracking with despair. David looked at the basement door. He had one chance left. It wasn't about the data anymore. It was about the physical reality of the product. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the stairs. They scrambled down into the damp, cold darkness of the basement. David didn't head for the storage room. He headed for the water heater. Behind the copper pipes, he had hidden a small emergency kit. Not for a fire or a flood, but for this exact moment of systemic collapse. He pulled out a heavy wrench and a set of forged passports he'd acquired years ago after his father's death. A paranoid precaution that had finally become a necessity. He kicked out the small glass-blocked window that led to the backyard. "Go," he whispered to Sarah. "Take the car at the end of the block, the blue one. The keys are under the wheel well. Go to your sister's in Indiana. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" she sobbed. "I have to go to the source," David said, his voice hardening. "I have to find a valve that hasn't been scrubbed." He watched her disappear into the night. Then he hauled himself through the narrow window and vanished into the shadows of the Chicago suburbs. 2 hours later, David stood at the perimeter of the Apex shipping warehouse on the south side. The facility was a monument to industrial coldness, a vast, echoing space of corrugated steel and flickering floodlights. The air smelled of diesel fumes and wet concrete. He knew the layout. He had designed the quality control protocols for this very building. He slipped through a ventilation duct, his clothes tearing on the sharp metal edges. He dropped onto the concrete floor of the sorting bay, the rhythmic thud-clack of the conveyor belts vibrating through his boots. Thousands of crates were lined up, ready for the dawn distribution. These were the heart-link valves, the lethal batch. David reached the central logistics terminal. His fingers moved with a mechanical, desperate speed. He didn't try to delete the shipping orders. He knew they'd just be restored. Instead, he used his administrative override to change the classification of the entire lot. He swapped the medical-grade priority tag with scrap hazardous waste. The system groaned, the mechanical arms of the sorters pausing for a heartbeat before they began to reroute the crates. Instead of heading for the loading docks, the valves were diverted to the industrial incinerator at the far end of the facility. But he needed more. He needed a witness. He pulled out a burner phone and sent a series of encrypted GPS coordinates to a contact he'd kept in his ledger for years, a private investigator working for a rival medical firm. He included a brief, raw data burst of the metallurgical failure points. As he hit send, a voice echoed through the vast warehouse. "You always were obsessed with the details, David." Robert Sterling stood on the observation catwalk, his silver hair catching the light. Beside him stood Michael Davis. Michael didn't look like a traitor. He looked like a man who had finally stopped running. "David, stop," Michael called out, his voice echoing. "It's over. I have the logs, the real logs." David froze. Michael pulled a small, battered external drive from his jacket pocket. "I didn't take the bribe, David. I took the opportunity. I've been feeding Sterling's legal team fake files for months. The data they edited, it was a decoy. The real evidence is right here." The final realization hit David like a burst of sunlight. Michael hadn't been the weak link. He had been the deep-cover parasite, living inside the machine to destroy it from within. Sterling's face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged for Michael, but the sirens were already wailing outside the warehouse doors. The private investigators, the FBI, and the local police, all drawn by the conflicting signals David and Michael had sent, were converging on the facility. The climax was a blur of motion. The warehouse doors were kicked in, the air filling with the scent of ozone and the glare of 100 flashlights. Sterling was tackled to the ground, his silver hair pressed into the oily concrete. David stood in the center of the sorting bay, his chest heaving. He looked at the conveyor belt, where the last of the defective valves were being dumped into the scrap bin. He had lost his career. He had lost his house. He had lost the life he knew. But as the officers led Sterling away, David reached into his pocket and pulled out his ledger. He opened it to the last page and drew a single, thick line through the entry for the heart-link valve. A week later, David stood in the driveway of a small, nondescript house in a different suburb. The Chicago skyline was a distant, jagged memory on the horizon. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and the faint, sweet scent of Sarah's lavender air freshener. He watched his children playing on the lawn, their laughter a bright, clean sound that cut through the lingering echoes of the ballroom. He was a man without a title, a man whose name would forever be linked to a corporate scandal. But as he looked down at his hands, they were steady. The if-then logic of his life had finally reached its conclusion. He hadn't saved the world, and he hadn't cleared his father's name in the way he'd imagined. But he had stopped the clock. He had caught the flaw before the bridge collapsed. He closed the ledger and tucked it into his pocket. The world was still full of failures, of hairline fractures and hidden defects. But for the first time in his life, David Miller wasn't afraid of the dark. He knew exactly how to find the light.